Terrific. All right. Well, thank you for joining today, everybody. I see people are still streaming in. It's wonderful to have you with us. I am Gabi Conacher. I am the executive director and co-founder of Deep Connections, and I'm very excited to be here today in partnership with our friends at the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance, Rare Epilepsy Network, and Angelman Syndrome Foundation to co-host and produce this webinar to talk with all of you about the whole spectrum of things that are good to be thinking about as we're moving to do transition with our kids, and that can start early. Audrey will tell us. Audrey is an expert on this. She has been thinking about this and talking about this for many, many years. So we're really thrilled that she was willing to take time and energy to share it with you, all this wider audience. I know this will be an ongoing resource for many. Um, just a quick note that everyone who is joining, you are all on mute and your cameras are off, so you do not have to worry about running around and keeping up with everything that you're doing. But please feel free to listen as you're joining. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, share a little bit about what brought you here today, connect with one another as Audrey's sharing her information. Feel free to react, ask questions, use it as a place for conversation. And as we're working through, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A. And we will have a portion at the end where all our guests, who you see around here today on the screen, are going to join us back a little later to talk about their experiences. So this will be recorded and it will live in multiple places. You'll get all sorts of announcements about where this is. We want this to be accessible and open for as many people as possible. That is our goal. So we look forward to jumping in today, and thank you for being here. All right, Audrey, I'm going to pass it on to you, and the rest of us will join you on the panel in a little bit.
Can you see my slides?
Looks good.
Great, thank you. All right, well, you all know that we're here for Growing Together, Navigating the Life Stage Checklist for Families. I wanted to comment on the title because this was supposed to be a transition talk. And when I started looking at the transition checklist that we created with the Rare Epilepsy Network, I realized that this isn't about the transition being this one fixed moment in time, but it's about everything that happens leading up to it, and honestly, things that continue to happen throughout adulthood. So I'm really thinking of this as rather than the transition, navigating all these life stages that are going to help us be prepared when those things do happen, like becoming an adult. We have some sponsorship from UCB, so I want to thank them for supporting our transition resources. We've talked to them extensively about how important this topic is, and they've recognized that and agree. A little bit about me. I am the Director of Patient and Family Advocacy for the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance. I've been working with this organization for just about 10 years. And I support families, school teams, clinicians, researchers, other community members in accessing information about the outcomes of drug-resistant epilepsy and epilepsy surgery. So we are focused on supporting families getting to a surgical consultation, getting information about surgery and postoperative rehabilitation and lifespan questions. But really, any patient with drug-resistant epilepsy is someone that we consider in our community. So my son Bennett had a stroke in utero. He started seizing probably at birth, but we didn't recognize it until about 5 months of age because he had infantile spasms. And those of you who know anything about infantile spasms know that sometimes it can be hard to detect what it is. So it was missed for quite a long time. He failed many medications, ultimately had a hemispherectomy. And then he's had 3 brain surgeries. Actually, he had a aneurysm clipping surgery, a hemispherectomy, and then a VP shunt. And he's been diagnosed with multiple disabilities. The picture on the right is him last year when he got his first job with a lot of support from me through our vocational rehab department, where he's working part-time at a theater, and he's very happy to be doing that. He has a ton of support. But my question over the past 10 or so years is how are we going to support him and help him reach his full potential? That's going to look different for every single child, but an adult. But ultimately, that's the goal for all of us, for every parent here. We're all thinking about how can we help our children reach their potential, live the life that we've set up for them to continue living that life once we're gone. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what I consider key language, because as you enter the adult world, um, these programs are not entitlement programs. You have to qualify for them. So starting to really understand language that you can use as you start to think about and apply for programs. Under the IDEA for IEPs in the United States, I understand there's an international audience. So hopefully, I think the majority of this will apply, but a lot of what we're talking about is covered under US or state law. So I'll try to distinguish that throughout. So under IDEA, the US federal law, there's a category called severe and multiple disabilities. And that can sometimes be useful to get a team to understand a child that's more complex rather than having a single eligibility category. We have a whole IEP course, which I will share in our resources that you can watch to learn more about the different categories and why you would choose one. Also understanding what is a neurodevelopmental disorder and what is a DEE, or a developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. Obviously, Deep Connections, who we're partnering with, can tell you a lot about what DEEs are. Any child who has that severe epilepsy with developmental delays or regression, can be considered to have a DEE. I know there's specific epilepsies that fall in that category, but many, 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 many of our kids have a neurodevelopmental disorder, even if they don't have a diagnosed intellectual disability or a DEE. And understanding that and using that terminology can really help you access the proper services in adulthood, because you're showing that there's a lifetime impact of this condition. So as we all know, epilepsy is not something that is defined solely by seizures or seizure control. Even children who have seizure control still have lifelong developmental impacts, generally from the epilepsy they had, the original condition that caused them to have epilepsy, epilepsy surgery, lots of other reasons. So just be really aware that you want to, when you're writing letters for services in adulthood, you want to be using worst case scenario language and to access the services. It can be a little bit challenging, but I just wanted to highlight that. We are, as parents, we become the case managers for our young adults in adulthood. Navigating the transition to adulthood for a person with really severe and complex disabilities and medical needs, this is incredibly challenging. The pediatric world and the school system are actually coordinated care, multidisciplinary care, and integrated systems. Once you enter the adult world, it's siloed, and the case manager is the parent. So it can lead to a lot of burdens on us, as seen in this slide. We can use the IEP process to support our kids transitioning into adulthood and ourselves, but to be perfectly honest, school teams often don't do this very well. And the more impaired or severe the disability of the child is, the worse the schools are at thinking about transition or what's next. They are not future thinking. They're always thinking, okay, we're here this week and this is what we're doing. And I think as parents and caregivers, we can be that way as well. And in pediatric medical settings, we see the exact same thing. There is very little, if any, meaningful transition planning taking place. And I can tell you that there are, in the adult world, some children cannot find adult providers that will even take them because they don't want adults in their practice that have severe disabilities. I know this sounds horrible, but it's true. They don't have changing tables. They don't have the training. They don't understand the pediatric conditions, et cetera. So the importance of talking about this early and working with your pediatric team and your school team to start asking all of these questions cannot be understated. So it's really up to us as parents and caregivers to drive this process and understand what your young adult will need at every step along their journey, and actually older adult too, thinking about what's going to happen when you're gone. This can be a really heavy burden for us. So today we're going to talk about the steps along the journey, the different stages that get us to the cliff of adulthood, and what you can do to prepare for aging outside of the pediatric medical and school setting so that your young adult does not fall off the cliff. This is very common language that's used in the adult world. In some ways, I feel like it's unfortunate, but unfortunately very accurate. as scary as it is, starting to think about what will your child's life be in the future when you are gone? What needs to be in place to make sure that your child has access to the exact same services and supports and love and care that they have right now? So that's what we're going to try to cover today. It's quite a lot to cover, so we're not going to cover everything in today's session. Hopefully we can give you some things to talk about and some valuable resources. All of our organizations have resources that are available to help you along the way. And I just want to say for many of us, including myself, navigating this process is really overwhelming. So that's why community support is really critical. Parents often don't know where to start, so having a network to provide guidance, examples, emotional support, et cetera, that can really make a difference. I actually took a course that was offered by a financial planner, a special needs financial planner, where we met once a month and created our memo of intent as a group. And I just had this scheduled time that I did that every month, and it really helped me to get through that process. And we know that advocacy in our organizations, it's not just about making sure we meet the child's needs. It's about making sure that every family knows they're not alone in this journey. So some key things to think about when your child is transitioning from pediatric to the adult world. So there are legal changes in adulthood. So every state in the US has what's called the age of majority. It actually differs from state to state, which is kind of crazy. Most states, it's 18. I think there are a few where that age is 19. So what that means is they are legally an adult, regardless of their decision-making capacity. So they become an adult and you cannot make decisions on their behalf unless you have things set up in advance for them. Now, obviously, if your child is very impaired and nonverbal, there's going to probably be a little more leniency in that, but you want to really be aware of that. You need to set up decision-making protections for your child so that when they become an adult, you still have those the decision-making authority for them, if appropriate. Financial planning. So we need to start thinking about, again, we want to have the life that they have now when you're gone, right? So what does that involve? Probably some money. So setting up an ABLE account, any gifts that family might want to give can go into the ABLE account. You can have, other resources of money that goes into the ABLE account. Special needs trust. So some people use that where they have their life insurance policies or retirement benefits will fund the trust when they're gone so that it can be set up in advance, but it's not funded until the parent dies. And there are also pooled special needs trusts because some people say, well, I have no assets. How do I do this? So there are ways that you can join a pooled trust where you put in a certain amount, and then when your child when you die, sorry, your loved one will be cared for at a rate that's relative to what you've contributed. But you don't have to fund the whole ball of wax. Then there's, of course, healthcare transition, which I talked about a little bit earlier about the challenges with that. Family readiness. So this is something that actually comes up a lot in the literature when we talk about healthcare transition. One of the barriers to families transitioning out of pediatric care is they're not ready. I think because they're not prepared for it, there is really not a lot of healthcare transition happening in that age 12 to 24 range, but we need to prepare mentally and emotionally for these challenges that are coming up, which is why we're here today. And then really thinking about the holistic care of the adult. What are the responsibilities of the entire family? So sitting down and writing out what will I do, my husband and I, or whatever your family makeup is, the key parents or caregivers. What role will grandparents play? What role will the siblings play? What about other community members? When I was creating my son's memo of intent, I asked a friend of mine if she would like to be listed in his care team. And she said, oh, I'm not good at things like money or making decisions or taking care of stuff. And I said, yeah, but you love him and you bring him joy. And she's like, oh, yeah, I'll be the joy coordinator. So thinking really broadly about the different roles that people can play. We literally have it in his memo of intent that periodically, Bennett has a checklist of people that he can reach out to when he needs different types of support. And for joy, it's his Aunt Beth. So there's different ways to view that. So you've probably all heard the phrase eating the elephant, and I cannot think of a more appropriate metaphor for transition than to view it this way. You can't tackle this task at age 17 and 11 months, or the day they age out of their transition programs in school. We really need to do a little bit every day, every week, every year to be ready for this. Feels like a daunting task, and honestly it is, but if doing a little bit at a time will help you get there and not be totally insane. So the impetus for today's talk is the transition to adulthood checklist, or I'm now calling it the life stages checklist, which was created in collaboration with the Rare Epilepsy Network's Adult Transition Task Force. It was actually spearheaded by Amanda Moore of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, who is also here today. So thank you for spearheading this effort. The idea was to give you an overview of the steps to prepare for each phase of the child's life. There is a different level of support and resources in every state. And for those of you who are not in the US, I can't speak to what resources are available in different countries. But hopefully this will get you to start thinking about what might be needed at different stages. None of this information should be taken as legal, medical, or educational advice. So please check with an expert on anything I tell you. One of the financial advisors who I really like said you should get the answer 3 times and have it be the same from 3 different places before you think it's the right information. And I thought that was really good. So hopefully you've all received, oh, here we go. Let me just cover this one and then we'll move on to the checklist. So when to start? I will just say it's not going to, wherever you are, you're starting right now. So start today. Doesn't matter how old your child is. It's not going to get easier. You already are an expert in your child's condition. We know that individuals with complex needs require support across their lifetime. And we need to be really effective advocates to make sure that our children receive the supports, resources, accommodations that they need across their lifetime. So I would say that transition to adulthood planning should start when the child is diagnosed with a complex medical condition or disability. The moment you have that diagnosis, everything looks different related to transition. So you might have a child with a life-limiting illness where you're doing end of life planning at age 3. You might be thinking, my child is never going to be independent, but I'm not going to live forever, so my sibling's going to take care of them, right? What is that going to look like? It's not going to get easier, and you don't want to get caught off guard. And so I would just say when you start is today. Start right now. So we're just going to, the next dozen or so slides, we're just going to take the checklist and break it into pieces. I'm not going to read every piece of text on the slide because you should have the checklist. It should have been emailed to you. If not, we'll make sure to get that to you. All the links are clickable so you can access the resources throughout. Today on this slide, what I would like to highlight, and I cannot see the chat, so if there are questions that I need to be answering, please unmute and ask me. Shannon or Gabby, please. Today on this piece, I'd like to just talk about seeking parent support. So we have an education working group at the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance, a small group of volunteers who helps us review content and kind of just make sure I'm not missing anything. So we have a few more sets of eyes on things. And one of the parents I sent this to said, really, the best thing you can do is surround yourself with people who get it. So seek that support, finding early support groups, even if they don't seem perfect, like it might not be the exact fit, getting some other parents who are walking this journey with you. Like I said, finding the group that meets once a month to write their memo of intent or creating one, whatever it is that you might need to do. Create a will and start talking to an attorney about estate planning. Really at this young age, the early intervention ages, it can be important to start thinking about that just so you know how to prepare, right? Because many families have a child and they create a college fund, right? Well, for our children, it might look different. So we can start early thinking about that. What happens if I put $100 a month into this account? What will happen to it? And then creating that special needs trust and ABLE account. There was I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about financial, but I didn't not create my son's ABLE account until he was almost 18. And I could have benefited from having some money in that account to use to justify what ended up being a repayment for Social Security. So knowing all of that earlier would have been helpful for me. I did not realize that. And if you'd like to interrupt me and ask me any questions about anything else on this slide, you can, but we'll be covering everything as we go throughout
Yeah,
here.
Audrey, we've got our eye on the chat, and if people have questions that are relevant to answer in the moment, we'll pop in.
Yeah, yeah, great. So at age 3, the key point here is learn everything you can about your child's condition. Learn about their legal rights, which usually starts with understanding the IEP process. We have a great course on this called Navigating the IEP Process, which really walks you step by step through the process. Any child with a neurological condition, although we do focus on epilepsy surgery throughout, you don't have to have epilepsy surgery to benefit from the course. So I highly recommend that. Some things to review if your child has epilepsy would be the legal rights of children with epilepsy in school and childcare and Advocates Manual, which is linked here. I ended up going to Kinko's, I don't know if they're still around, but at the time, and got it printed and bound into a spiral bound book. It's about, I don't know, 150 pages. And I loved walking into IEP meetings with that book, I'll tell you. Learning about everything you can about the IEP process and school and learning and programs and resources. If your child is not going to have an IEP for whatever reason, because you're going to homeschool or private school, or maybe you're not in the US and you don't have an IEP, I still think it's important to understand what the child should be learning from stage to stage and making sure that you're trying to ensure whatever the progress is. In Deep Connections, they talk about inch stones instead of milestones, which I absolutely love that phrase. So we're still tracking, are there improved communication skills? Could we introduce eye gaze technology? Whatever it is going to be, so that they can have some participation in their life, and who's going to fund that and how are we going to do that? That can happen really anywhere. At 5 years, we are revising the IEP annually, of course. One thing I wanted to highlight here is to consider a safety plan, a family safety plan. This came up recently. We had one of our favorite speakers, Eileen Devine, who's a licensed clinical social worker, did a talk about siblings. And she talked about how in her family there's a safety plan because one of the siblings has violent behavior. It might even be a safety plan around medical emergencies. And both Monica Jones, our executive director and founder, and I were both like, I've never even heard of this. What a great idea. So how do you support the typical children? If you have a plan in advance and you talk through it, this is what we're going to do when X happens, when we have to go to the emergency room in the middle of the night, when your sibling is having a massive seizure or a behavior issue, or is, whatever other intervention. Having that in advance, I think, is a really, really great idea. I did link that in our resources at the end, that particular talk. It's called What About My Other Kids, that particular presentation. I highly recommend it. At age 6 to 11 years, you're revising the IEP annually, review everything you've missed in the previous sections, or start working on what's coming up in the coming sections. And then 12 to 14 years, this is where I think you really need to understand your child's graduation plan. If your child has the capacity of graduating with a regular diploma, but they're not being given instruction to get them to that grade level content, that's a conversation to have with the team. It shouldn't be the team's decision what kind of diploma the child has, or actually it is a team decision and parents are part of that team. And actually even the young person themselves, the student, should be part of that decision making as well. And developing that transition plan, we have a whole course on this and a guide as well that you can go through. And I'll be speaking on this again next month at the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates about how do you use the transition plan in the IEP process to support everything that's coming in the transition to adulthood, including healthcare transition and independent living skills, et cetera. If your child isn't going to have the ability to do these skills themselves or make decisions themselves, it's a notice for you as the parent or caregiver to think, oh, okay, this is something I'm going to need to learn about. How am I going to do this, or what supports do I need to put in place for this? And start the healthcare transition conversation with your providers at this age. I started talking about it at this age with my child's providers, my son's providers, and it was a heavy lift because there's not really, even at a very high level, big high volume center in a big metropolitan city, they were not prepared to help us with transition. So I learned a lot about what was required for the transition to adulthood in the medical realm, and I would bring it back to the team. I'm still honestly, my son's 21, and I'm still fighting about aspects of that transition, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. So I would start the conversation early. If you have a particular provider or two or three that you like, make them your allies. Offer to help them, help your team understand transition, their teams understand transition better, and then really start to think about who will my child's providers be in adulthood, because a lot of adult providers are not trained in dealing with childhood illnesses, especially complex illnesses or brain surgeries or whatnot. So really starting to think about that. We also have to think about sexuality and relationships, because our kids become legal adults physically, become adults physically and legally, whether we like it or not. And so thinking about sexuality, I have a resource at the end, and relationships, and what is that going to look like? How are you going to support that? What's meaningful for your child in that area? It's really important. Um, and then this is a good time to start learning about your state's long-term care and home and community-based services options, HCBS options. So HCBS, I'm going to use the acronym from here on out, is Medicaid funded services for adults with significant disabilities to be part of their communities, to not live in group homes. Every state has some funding through Medicaid for the HCBS services. So you want to find out, what does your state offer? How do I access this? I will say, working with state agencies, oftentimes going and saying, what can you do for me, elicits a blank stare. But if you find out what the state is obligated to provide and go to the agency in question and say, I want you to provide X, Y, and Z. I know you need to do this. Let's get started. So that's how most of the adult services have worked for my son. I would say to our vocational rehab department, hey, can you help me with employment stuff and job coaching for my son? And they're like, yeah, we don't have that. And then I found out that they did. I found out what agency they worked with. I found a job coach for him. And I just basically then sent a follow-up email months later saying, here's the job coach, please put in a purchase order for this. And they did. So sometimes that's why we as caregivers have to know this stuff, so we know how to ask for it. And then starting to develop a future plan for your young adult. This is like an IEP, only for all aspects of their adult life. You might call your future plan a person-centered plan, a transition portfolio, a vision statement, or I use the term letter of intent or memo of intent, because that's what we have created. But these are some things to think about at this age. At age 16, make sure you have some form of government ID for your young person well before their 18th birthday, be it a driver's license, an ID, a passport. You will need this documentation for a lot of these adult services. Sometimes a birth certificate is acceptable, but usually they're going to want some form of government issued ID. In addition, you're really pushing on that transition plan in the IEP. If you think your young person is going to want to be or able to be in a work-based learning or a volunteer opportunity, start learning about options around that. So I had a friend I was helping a few years ago, and her son is very severely impaired with a rare genetic condition, nonverbal, but loves, loves, loves the zoo. It's his favorite place on earth. And so while the school was trying to write IEP goals around wiping down tables and cleaning out buckets at the zoo, we ended up crafting goals around interacting with guests and visitors to the zoo with one-to-one support, which is available in our state through our HCBS funded program, which is our regional center. So there's things that are available that you might not think of. So start to find out what they are. Start to think about guardianship and conservatorship. We could spend an hour or two or three just on this topic. What I will say here is that so your child will become a legal adult. If you don't set up the appropriate decision-making supports well before their 18th birthday, you could get in a situation where you apply for, let's say, it's called conservatorship or guardianship in different states. So I'm using both terms interchangeably here because it depends on your state law. But if you wait until, let's say, 17 and a half and submit your paperwork, and then they say, yeah, that's great, we don't have a court date for 18 months. So that means you're going to have a year of not having any legal decision-making authority for a child, a young adult who maybe is nonverbal and can't make their own decisions. So you want to really make sure you're making these decisions early. For my son, we considered things like person-centered planning and power of attorney. Due to the complexity of his medical condition, we opted for conservatorship, but we sort of use a person-centered planning model where we allow him to make the majority of his life decisions, but we have the protections in place of a conservatorship, the California term for this, so that we can protect him from things that might go awry in the future, and we can advocate for him in a medical setting. And then, if possible, start to work on having your teen understand their own healthcare needs and how to manage them. Not every teen is going to be able to do this. So then again, that's a signal to mom and dad or caregiver to say, okay, well, they're never going to be able to do this. So maybe you're going to start to create that medical binder, that one-page summary to hand off to new clinicians, and really, thinking about what information would I want to have go with them from place to place, right? And then thinking about how to handle both emergency and non-emergency medical situations, et cetera, thinking about high-risk behaviors and whatnot. At age 17, if you haven't already, you have to learn about the transfer of parental rights and those other legal changes at the age of majority. Like I said, a couple states, most states it's 18, some it's 19. Get ready to assume that guardianship or conservatorship if appropriate. You might need legal aid. You might need to hire an attorney. If you don't have the funds to hire an attorney, you need to start even earlier because most free legal aid services have a 1 to 2 year waiting list, so don't wait. And then I would recommend, regardless of what level of function you think your adult will have, applying for SSI on the first day of the month after they turn 18. Because even if they end up going on to employment and earning enough money to not need SSI, it qualifies them for Medicaid for the rest of their life if they qualify for SSI. Once they've entered adulthood and possibly worked a job and earned some money, which some of our kids can do, it's harder to qualify for the SSI. So doing it right out the gate can be helpful, and then you get that Medicaid for life, even if you lose the SSI income because of your employment income. Applying for adult services with different agencies. So it might be your Department of Developmental Services, Vocational Services, the HCBS waiver services, whatever it is that you might need. And again, writing your letter of intent and including your end of life wishes and plans for your young person as well. Like, what would you want for that to have happen for them? In our memo of intent, we have both what will happen when we die and what will happen when our son dies, very clearly articulated. And then by 18, we've got guardianship in place. And remember, if you're a little bit late getting started, there can be a several months to even a year or more wait to get that set up. And you don't want that, that the child to not be able to make their own decisions for that period of time. So start early, have that SSI funding in place, hopefully with monthly payments. Just note that about 80% of SSI applications are rejected and you have to reapply, but that they are retroactively paid to the date you applied. So if you apply on the first day of the month after their 18th birthday, then you would earn retroactive pay when you appeal. A majority of people do win on their case on appeal. If your young person can vote, have them register to vote, but note that every single male in the United States has to register for selective service, no matter how disabled they are. And if you don't register, it can actually disqualify you for federal benefits. So there is an exemption form. The exemption form is you have to be institutionalized, basically, is really the only exemption. So the way we understand it is, and again, get this verified by at least 2 other sources. But what we've done is we've applied for our son. He's registered for selective service. If he was ever called up, we would explain his disability and he would not actually have to serve. I'm going to move on here. Ages 19 to 20. Well, one thing I didn't talk about is thinking about living situations. Where is your young person going to live? You can start applying for Section 8 housing. There may be local and regional housing lists. Sometimes there are communities like, Jewish or Lutheran or, Christian or whatever faith communities sometimes build communities for adults with disabilities that are appropriate. Really thinking about that and making sure you're finalizing that transition from pediatric to adult physician and any needed specialists. We do have a guide to healthcare transition after epilepsy surgery, which would apply to everyone. All right, so now we're at 19 to 20. So some young adults will stay in school until ages 21 to 24. One question that came in beforehand is why are the ages all different? That's because we're the United States. Every state gets to make their own rules within reason. So the minimum age that a school can kick out a child is 21. I think that's the earliest. I think that 26 is the latest. I think that's Michigan. And some states got an extension of that due to COVID, where they actually added an extra year for how long the young person can stay in their transition program. But really starting to think about those, especially during those final transition years when they're out of high school and they're in their transition program, what are we working on, right? Finding housing, figuring out what they're going to be doing with their day, figuring out where they're going to live, who's going to care for them, do they need 24-hour care? If they're going to stay at home, how are we funding all of this? Are there any nursing services that are available? Are there any other supports that are available for the family? You can live at home and still access home and community-based service waivers. Your home can be anywhere as an adult with a disability, and you can still access those services. The other thing is to really make sure transportation services are in place before the school district services end. Oftentimes there's all these great ideas about the things that this young person will do, and there's no transportation set up, especially if they need a specialized van or some other transit systems. Once they age out of the school system, the school is not responsible anymore. So now you have to have an adult agency that agrees to do this and will fund it. And then 21 to 26, so whatever year you're aging out of special education, you're going to make sure that you have prepared for the transition to adulthood, what the day is going to look like. It should look the exactly same as the day before they aged out, which means you're spending those transition years gearing up for creating that program. So there isn't really an actual abrupt change, right? That would be the ideal. Someone did ask in a question in advance about day programs. I will note that some day programs will not accept a child or a young adult that requires one-to-one assistance, and some won't accept individuals that aren't toileted. So independently toileting. So thinking about tailored day services, which can be funded under home and community-based service programming. You're going to need to start thinking about this well before it happens, right? So that's why maybe entering the transition program is when you're starting to think about what's their day-to-day life going to look like afterwards, transportation, funding, one-to-one support, all of that. And then for all of these children, even if they had Medicaid as a child, because a lot of our kids qualify under pediatric, usually it depends on your state, it's between 18 and 22. You have to reapply for Medicaid in your state. And this is different than the SSI Medicaid. So if you apply for SSI and get it, you're getting Medicaid that way. But if you haven't done that, or in my son's case, he was denied, we had to appeal. And so for the 18 months on appeal, we applied for our state Medicaid, and he was on that just as an independent adult with with that need. And then now that he's got SSI, it's through the SSI. Okay, let's see here. Healthcare transition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You have this information. But again, we go back to all the same things we've talked about. Start early. Really, if your child needs lifelong support, we're really thinking about that guardianship, decision-making, navigating those adult systems, really thinking about those high-risk patients with epilepsy and comorbidities. What is the plan to make sure they have that comprehensive multidisciplinary care in adulthood? Again, we could spend 1 to 3 hours just talking about this slide right here. So we're going to not have enough time to go over this. Making sure that planning is individualized. Again, in adulthood, it's going to be caregiver driven or the individual with disabilities driven, which is not often possible, but you can still have that plan in place. You can write the plan, right? So who has to follow it? Well, that depends on each adult agency, but you can at least have the plan of care. And I have a resource for that as well. And then making sure that you're going beyond a handoff, really establishing those relationships with the adult providers. And then one really important thing is transition is an important time to reassess treatment strategies. So it's possible that as a child, you've tried different drugs and none of them worked. or they're on polypharmacy, multiple medications for epilepsy, or epilepsy surgery was considered and they weren't a candidate, or they had surgery and it's no longer working to control their seizures. We attend the American Epilepsy Society and other meetings every year, and I can tell you there are incredible advances in treatment options for patients with epilepsy. One of my favorite is Danielle Andrade. She's in Toronto, and she talks about how every adult neurologist getting one of these young adults should be redoing genetic testing, redoing imaging, reconsidering epilepsy surgery, and looking at, is there a treatment modality that is available now that would be effective that maybe wasn't in the past? So here's just a few of our key resources. I've mentioned them throughout, and you should be receiving this deck with clickable links. So I'm not going to talk about this right now, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of my other favorite resources that everyone on this call should know about. So there's something called the Care Binder. Actually, Deep Connections and some of the other partner organizations created this with support from UCB, and it's called the Caring for Adults with a Rare Epilepsy Binder or Guide. And it's like 150 pages. It's a little bit daunting. There's a clickable PDF version, or you can print it out and download it. It's free. And it's a great step-by-step tool to walk you through everything we just talked about for whoever will be taking care of your child when they are in adulthood. So this can serve as that memo of intent. I had already written my memo of intent, so I might dip into this and look at different things that I may have missed and make sure they're added to mine. But I highly recommend taking a look at this. National Care Advisors is a national organization. They specialize in creating comprehensive life plans for people with complex medical needs, and they hire nurses. So all of their care plans are created and administered by nurses. And some states fund National Care Advisors. So my son is able to get funding through our regional center to cover this service. In other states, it may not be available, but they can work with you on how to fund their services. So earlier before the webinar, we were chatting and Gabby mentioned, like, it's that question of thinking about what will my young person be doing when I'm gone? How are they going to take care of him the way I do? They're not going to know all of this stuff. So National Care Advisors is an organization that has that continuity of care in mind for really complex individuals. The Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates is a great resource for anything considering the legal ramifications of the IEP process, or even what happens in adulthood. The talk I'm doing next month with an attorney, we're going to focus a lot on what employment and adult setting laws, because they do change. And then lastly, Elevate is training. They are an organization that provides evidence-based and trauma-informed education on sexuality for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they are a phenomenal resource. They have some free trainings for families. They have trainings for caregivers. We've had agencies that have worked with my son. We've had all of their staff trained in their practices because, like I said, physically they become adults, whether we like it or not. And thinking about this is really important. The Rare Epilepsy Network is a phenomenal resource. We are partnered with them, as is Deep Connections and Angelman Syndrome Foundation and all of the others that you see on this list here. So please take a look at these different organizations. Find the one that fits your child's condition, and if not, just reach out. You can just reach out to Ren in general to get more information. Remember, building that community is so important. That's what I have for you. So I'm going to stop there and we can shift into the panel. I will say one final word, though, before we do that. This was a lot of information. I know if I was sitting down and hearing all of this for the first time, I would probably want to go sit in the closet and cry. So here's what I want you to take away. What is working in your child's life or your young adult's life, and how can you replicate that and carry it over? What brings you and your child or your young person joy? And can you find support to help you navigate this process? Thank you.
Wow. Okay. I think before we move on, we have to just pause for a minute and say thank you, Audrey. You are such an incredible advocate. You have clearly honed your skills over the years and learned everything you could about this process to help families. And we're so grateful that you're sharing it with this wider community, not just today, but all the time. So really grateful for all of that. And as everybody has heard, there will be lots of resources shared, so don't panic. You will get all of this and you can follow it at your own pace. Okay, so at this point, I'd love for everybody to go around and give a little bit of introduction about yourself and your loved one that has brought you on this journey here today, so that everybody knows who's on the panel with us today. And then we'll jump in. We got some questions in advance, and people can feel free to keep dropping them into the Q&A. So Dale, let's start with you.
Okay. Dale Todd. I'm the father of a young man, Adam Todd. I'm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, at 3.5 years old. Adam woke up from with a little bit of a fever and then went into a series of cluster of seizures. And that was, 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago. We have had it's been a crazy ride. There's no way around it, and one that we had never anticipated. But the good news is my wife is a nurse, and I'll be honest, probably the first year or second year of Adam's diagnosis, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was depressed, and I was walking around in a constant state of depression, and didn't realize it. The good news is that he's on a combination of 5 meds, anti-seizure meds. And that being said, we have a pretty good quality of life in terms of his seizures don't happen until he wakes up in the morning, between 5 in the morning and probably when I get his first dose in him at 6:30. Like if we could get past that, we'd be fine. But I've been involved in there. The good news is you showed all the support organizations out there and all the networks. And then you talked about AES and all the new meds that are in the pipeline. Back when, you got to remember, back not too long ago, there was Depakote, there was phenobarbital, there was Topamax, and that was about it, And so the point was made earlier, if something doesn't work initially, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, go back, because the brain is always changing, and what might not work then will work today. But
You're right. Yeah,
all of
there's
a
so much
sudden I've
hope on
got
the
this new
horizon. It's
family of
true.
people, and they're all you, and so it's been it'd be nice if life was different, but we don't have any options. We got to deal with it.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. I know you've been advocating for many years across the epilepsy. So thank you for your work.
Yeah. I
Christina,
didn't
tell us
plan
a
on
little.
doing this, just so you know. Okay.
Yeah. Right. This was not the plan we all made.
I think I heard my name, so I'll
Yes, please
jump
go
in.
ahead.
My name is Christina Hone. I'm coming from Cascade Foundation and the Rare Epilepsy Network. And my growing together journey has been kind of complex because there's kind of 3 significant individuals. It started with my brother, who had Cartagener's syndrome and later had a damage to his pacemaker that led to a brain injury and epilepsy. And in his case, we helped him to gain independence, but as he grew older, that independence slowly was taken from him till he passed at the age of 42. Later, I was chosen by the family to help coach my autistic niece into a life of independence, and she lives in the community here near me. Very, very proud of her. Currently, I'm having to really kind of get on the ball with planning for my daughter. I have a daughter with a Casc gene mutation. She's definitely the most severely affected of anyone I've had to care for, and we're definitely on the track towards conservatorship. We know that she's going to need that level of support because of her complex medical needs and her very complex communication challenges. So on one hand, I feel like I've kind of been there, done that, but then I'm also facing something that I am completely new to. So I'm incredibly grateful to this community and the things that even I'm learning at this stage for what I still have before me. And she's 13 at this point. So we're entering the hard years.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Christina. Holly.
Hey everybody, I'm Holly Powick. I'm coming to you from Indiana. I am actually a parent of 2. My youngest My daughter Avery's 19. She was born with a brain malformation, hemimegalencephaly, it's known as. She's totally dependent. So I would say, like, we've been at this for 19 years at this point. It really started at birth. She had catastrophic epilepsy, and much like Audrey shared earlier, was seizing really in the womb. Um, we I'm trying to think our biggest challenges. In many ways, we're still working through so many pieces of this that Audrey shared about. We are trying to establish our future plans around financial aspects, of course. We are in the throes of adult healthcare transition, those sorts of things. So a lot is happening, a lot of lessons learned. I am also an active parent leader and have experience in parent to parent and more recently care coordination for children with medical complexity. I share that just because it lends some additional maybe insight. I'm excited to be here to engage and contribute, but also to learn for ourselves.
Thank you so much, Holly. And I'll just briefly share. So I introduced myself at the top, but I didn't share what brought me on this journey. I am mom to 12-year-old Elliot, who has an SCN8A developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. He is completely dependent and will likely never gain any sort of independence. Every move of his body is done by us. Every bodily function is really moderated by us. So we don't anticipate that he will leave our care, but what will happen when we're not here any longer? And so I think we're in the process of trying to do more of this work. We've met with lawyers, we've done all that, but we got stuck. Is who's going to take care of Elliot when we're gone? Because my parents would, but they can't carry around an 88-pound kid and manage his care alone. So really challenging to think about that. And he's also one of these kids that is very, very hyper specific. He has to be in this position, not that position, or he can't breathe right. So anyway, we'll get more into that as we discuss here, but I think this is a really great mix of experiences, people who are early in the planning, those who are kind of have been in the mix of it. I think, one of the big things we asked the community in advance, our Shannon, our program coordinator at Deep Connections, who's in the background helping manage things. Thanks, Shannon. Asked the community in advance some of the biggest questions they had about transition. And one of the things they came up is that period of transition out of school and into adult programs. And, you started talking about that, Audrey, but how do you find adult programs? What do you know is possible? How do you make sure you can get in? There's so many questions about what does that even look like? And for some, it can mean working and having a job. And for others, maybe all of you can share a little bit about what you've seen, Holly and Dale in your experiences as well. So who wants to take that one? Holly, go for it.
I can. I think when it comes to finding programs, many of these things are state level, right? They may receive federal funding, but many of them also take state dollars. And so really they are implemented at the state level. So one of the things I strongly encourage in working with other parents as well is to connect with your state level parent to parent organizations. Every state has a family to family health information center. Most of our states have a state chapter of the ARC. Many of them have a number of parent-to-parent organizations, and they all have a parent training and information center who helps with the transition. Well, IEP, special education itself, but also are going to be really versed in that transition period. And so oftentimes they're a really good source to learn what programs exist in your state. They have often worked with a number of parents over the years, so they've also learned from other parents what is working well, what sort of programs that they would recommend. And I think, somebody said earlier, connecting with other parents, finding other parents in your state, connecting with support groups. They are a great place to learn about those services and supports as well. Don't discount, your physicians aren't always going to know about them, but don't discount also asking members of your care team what they might be able to share, because they're often learning from families as well, and then have that information that they can pass along too.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great. Does anybody want to add to that? I know, Christina, you've been through transition with a couple of people, it sounds like. So,
Yeah, I would say while there are government funded programs and specific organizations that are state run, there in many areas you might also be able to find kind of local charities, local foundations that are not disease specific. Some of them might not even really have a focus on this transition or on those types of services. But a lot of times, especially with social media being what it is now, they'll have like a family group on Facebook associated with it. And that can become a parent community where you can just put out a question to them in that setting and just say, hey, what's in the area? This is where I live. Who's close to me? And it really is the parents that become the experts in those situations. But I would definitely put social media to use that way.
mhm.
I think one of the challenges is there, there's not, I'm not aware of a lot of places that don't have limited programming for our kids. And so 9 times out of 10, you have to get on a waiting list. And that waiting list might be 2, 3 years, 3-year wait. And so you have to get on that before your child actually gets to the place where they're going to transition. I know that around our house, there was a lot of angst about this transition, but I try to put it in perspective because you had this angst when they got out of kindergarten. You had the same angst when they got to junior high, in elementary, and then in high school, that same angst. Here, it's just another chapter, and try to think of it as an opportunity. I've really come across some places where families and parents have actually created their own programming. Thought outside the box, utilized the same state funding streams, but created their own mechanism for programming, maybe at home or at another place.
Yeah, that's great. And Lindsay is asking about how do we start looking for the adult programs. I think you can go back and listen, and there were some that were dropped throughout here, but local programs like the ARC or other resources. And you can also call your local government and ask them what services are available, right, for like adult programs. So I think you just have to start getting creative, and maybe even start Googling and looking things up and seeing what's around. But I
Can I add
definitely,
something there as well?
yeah, please.
So when my son was entering school, preschool and kindergarten and whatnot, he went to 2 preschools, he went to 3 elementary schools. And every time, when we did this, I was like, oh my God, it's going to be so traumatic to move him from X placement to X placement. It was like, no, this one's better. And I think it's the same thing in adulthood. I think we all want that to know that there is a program out there that is perfect for our child that's going to work. And we may find that program and get on the waiting list in time and get accepted and get our kid there, and they hate it. Or it's actually not what we thought it was on the outside. So as a parent who's living this and dealing with it, it is a lot of work, but it's always going with the flow and recognizing, okay, that didn't work. What else is there? And really, your best resource in any of this is talking to other parents in your community that are walking the same path, because there's no state list anywhere. There might be a list of places you can go visit, but to have that real understanding about what these programs are like, living or day programs or whatever it's going to be, talking to others who have been through it is really, really important. Or just trying the placement, right, for a while and seeing, does this work? Can we work out the kinks, etc. But I don't think there is a perfect placement. There's no database nationally of like, here's where you go. It's very, very frustrating. And in terms of when you start looking, you look early and get on those waiting lists, but be prepared to know that, well, that particular placement might not work out. So do we have a couple of other backups in case we're thinking, well, this is really not going to be the right situation? That's one of the things National Care Advisors does when they create your care plan, is they look at they have 3 options for living situation, so that if one doesn't work, you have backups, and they're all kind of fleshed out. So and they're all real plans based on, what your income is, what you can access in your state, all of that. So something to think about.
Yeah, and Maria in the chat is talking about creating spaces where there aren't any, and I think and that's what Dale is talking about too. And sometimes that's what we have to do, right? And that's a beautiful opportunity to bring your community together where there isn't that support. So that's great, Maria. I want to talk about conservatorships and guardianships. I think this is for a lot of us. I mean, for me in particular, this is what I mentioned a little bit ago. How do we, when do you start thinking about this? How do you decide what makes the most sense? I mean, for those of you that have been through this, do you want to share a little bit about what that process looked like, how you negotiated and made decisions around this, and who you engaged? Dale, how about you?
Well, it took us a long time to get to that point. It was there's a bit of denial internally. You don't want to deal with it because you don't want to deal with it because what's the next step in that transition? Ironically, your child is transitioning at the same time you're transitioning, and so we kicked the can down the road to finally it got to a point where it really was interfering with our marriage to the degree that we both knew we had to do this, but we were reluctant about doing it. So finally we got an attorney and we did the wills, the guardianships, the estate planning, those kind of things. And I'll tell you a funny story. We did all that, and 2 days ago I went to look for it and I couldn't find it on my computer. So I know it's somewhere, but it helps to have it accessible. But once we did it, I have to share with you, it is like the biggest weight off your back. I mean, it is just huge in terms of, we don't have anything else to argue about now other than me. And so once I mean, it takes time, not a lot of money, but a little bit of money. You want to make sure that it's done right with somebody that's been through not just every attorney does this. You want an attorney that handles kids with special needs. But once it's done, I mean, you really breathe a sigh of relief.
Yeah. And I think for me, we've started the process, and I think I started getting hung up on the fact that it wasn't perfect, but you can always go back and change it, right? So getting something legally in place is really great, and then it can always be adopted and changed, right? So that's good to remember. Go ahead, Audrey. Yeah.
So I just want to speak to this. There is a movement afoot in the United States for supported decision making. The idea is that you're giving the individual with a disability a right to have a say over their own life, which I 100% support. I do think that the person with a disability should be making decisions about their own lives. They should have choices in their own lives. And then the pandemic hit. My mother has Alzheimer's, and I could not go into the hospital with her when she got a UTI and was having worsening dementia. And I chatted with the nurse about it. I said, but I have a power of attorney. I have her advanced healthcare directive. And so we ended up chatting for like a while because the ER was empty and my mom had gone in and I couldn't go in. And I said, so what do I need? And she's like, you need, to be a legal guardian, conservator or guardian. And I know the rules have changed around COVID. But that notion that I could not walk in the door with my son at age 25, 30, 35, 50, whatever it is, if I'm still alive, and advocate for what he needs in a medical setting after a very, very complex surgical history. That was then that day, I was like, no, forget the supported decision making. Now, I think I mentioned this when I spoke, that I use the supported decision making model with my son. He is capable of making a lot of decisions about his own life. And we did hire an attorney. It goes to a court. So this is something that parents are often scared about. They're like, well, now the court is making decisions about your child. That's not really true. You can have a successor guardian you should have someone that you would nominate. The court still gets to decide. So if that person has a criminal record or has other reasons, they could say no on appointing that person. We have 3 people named, so if we were to die suddenly, that they could go, they'd also have to go before a judge. but the court appoints an attorney for the individual with a disability as well. So they get to have a say to their level of ability about what rights they're willing to relinquish. In California, it's broken up into 7 powers. It's almost impossible to get relationships or marriage unless the child has been sexually abused or has been a sex offender, no matter their level of disability. So we did not get that for our son. He also articulated, I don't want my parents to control my relationships or marriage. Okay, fine. But we have contracts, we have legal, we have medical, you know what I mean? So we have other protections if for some reason he was conned into a marriage to access his benefits or some craziness, we could get him out of it, right? So really understanding what is the tool you want and why, and then just getting it. And like you said, Gabby, you can change it. We have every year the court contacts us to revisit. I'm sorry, I think it's every 2 years now to revisit the conservatorship. That's in California. Asks Bennett, are your conservators treating you well? Do you want to continue with this? Because he is capable of answering these questions. I think for young people who aren't, it would be more of a formality. And there's always an opportunity to change it, to appoint someone else, to, even while you're still alive, maybe at the end of your life, bringing in the person you want and helping them through the process while you're still present to make it, and making that switch right at that time. That's always the really scary part. Who is going to do that though, right? I think that's part of what's hard. But in the meanwhile, we need to have those protections in place so they're not left without that. You can't even sign documents or apply for SSI, accept checks, payments, etc. if you don't have a legal decision maker. If your young person can't, and you're not given that role legally, you can't do that. So really important to address.
I would
That's a
add
great
just a couple things if I can. To Dell's point earlier, one of the things that I've started doing is I carry a copy of those forms on my phone so that I have them in whatever setting I'm at, that I find that I need to show proof that I'm the legal decision maker. In her case, Avery's case was pretty clear cut. There wasn't a lot of pushback, but I was surprised by 2 things. One, because she had an adult sibling, he actually had to sign forms saying that he was waiving notice of the hearing and that he approved our appointment as co-guardian. So knowing that siblings may have to be involved in that process might be important. And then for me, I was much more emotional about it than I expected to be during the actual hearing. And I think it's not a big deal, it's consequential. It is a huge deal to attest to your child's incapacity and take away their legal rights to make decisions for themselves, even when it's appropriate and the right thing to do. So
Hey, I've got one real life situation. The other day, I had a woman who was 21. She was in the middle of having a cluster of seizures. They were going to take her away in the ambulance. They wouldn't let the mother get in the ambulance with her because of the guardianship issue. And just so you know, you don't want paramedics messing around with your kid's seizures meds. That's sort of like the worst case scenario you want. So she was able to get to the hospital in time, but that's the kind of stuff that happens when you don't have that paperwork in place.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think, it's interesting thinking about this from a perspective of, I guess, I'm kind of in the more where you are, Holly, that my kid cannot communicate wants and
Yeah, mine.
desires. And, I think it's very heavy because it's also, we're taking that, what we wish was their autonomy to be able to do that. And, I've spent the last 12 years making every single decision for my kid, right? Which is like, which position are you going to lie in today? Are you going to sit? Are you going to stand? When do you get your feeds? When do you don't tell me when you're hungry? So there's just this real heaviness around all of this, I think, as well, in terms of, just what it means, for our kids' lives, and coming to terms with the fact that they aren't making those decisions on their own, which is really hard. I wonder, Christina, will you talk a little bit about that transition for IEP plans? I know you've got, a long background in working in this, and I think that's something that probably weighs on a lot of people too, thinking about that.
Yeah, just kind of touching back to where this kind of started, that a lot of people, especially I think those whose kids are more severe on the spectrum, they think it's going to be a given. And so they don't really think about making these plans ahead of time. We, speaking with a special needs attorney recently, he said that, even if it is a given, you've got to start early. You've got to start at the age of 13 here in Utah, is what his recommendation was. And the school system and the IEP system is very similar. I'm just saying, if you're going to be planning for goals that come after high school, the law is that by the age of 14, the school has to have what they call a transition plan in place as part of the IEP. And it's basically just a document proving that the team has put some thought into what is this child going to do after high school. And it is an opportunity for, at this point, this is when the child becomes a more active participant in the IEP process, where they try to get them to indicate what are their interests, what are their goals, and to ensure that the team is crafting IEP goals around that long-term plan as well. But I think Audrey touched on this earlier, that oftentimes those IEP teams, they don't really think it through. They have kind of bucket lists of goals that they're accustomed to putting on there that are focused on very basic things, like making sure they can wash their hands independently, making sure they can wipe a table, like maybe they might wipe a fast food table, but that doesn't really take into consideration what this individual child's interests are. And so that's the point where the parent really has to kind of speak up for them and say, well, my child is interested in science, and this is a future volunteer opportunity that is science related, and how is this guiding them towards that specific life goal, rather than just like this general independent skills ADLs viewpoint. You really have to kind of take a stand for it and say, if we're preparing for this life, this is what their interests are, and we need to focus on that. But yeah, it's just definitely something to be aware of, that, once your child is 13 years old, adulthood is literally right around the corner in the paperwork and the planning. And that's when you really have to speak up and try to do some of that advanced research ahead of time, so that you can tell the IEP team, here are opportunities in the community that we're working towards, that we're targeting. So those are the opportunities that these goals need to be centered on.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So we did have a question about what is the age when someone should apply for SSI, and if it's important to get a diagnosis of IDD diagnosed, even if they have a genetic diagnosis, in order to qualify for SSI. I guess the bigger question is, when do you apply, and what qualifications are there
I can
for
speak to this one as well, if
Sure.
you don't mind that. I would say, if you are aware that that your child is going to have a level of severity that might prevent independence, I would say apply then. Oftentimes people think that they can't apply for it until they're income qualified. But in our case, we actually applied when Eliana was 1 year old. And at the time we income qualified, and she actually received payments, but then for a while, we didn't qualify income wise, but she is still eligible for SSI. She technically still has SSI eligibility. We're just, when we report the income and they say she's not eligible for a payment, that doesn't remove her from the SSI eligibility. So I would say, do it now. Do it as soon as you think that they might need that support. Don't wait until they're 18. I would say just do it as soon as possible.
Mm.
And so the other thing to note is, if your child qualifies for SSI or Medicaid waiver under age 18, they need to reapply as an adult. So it's not a rollover. Again, there can be some time variations by state, but usually it's age 18. A friend of mine who's an attorney accidentally applied for SSI the same month her child turned 18, and it ended up becoming a huge legal snafu, which is why I said the first day of the month after they turn 18, when they are 18 the entire month. I know that seems like ridiculous, and this is not printed anywhere. It took her 2 years to untangle this, and she's an attorney. So the first day of the month after their 18th birthday, you can fill out the form online, and then I would immediately schedule an appointment with your local Social Security office and walk in. They will do their own evaluation of your child, which will be completely meaningless and useless by someone who knows nothing about your child's condition. I think bringing whatever documentation you can, in addition to what they're going to provide, can help your case. An IDD diagnosis is not required to receive SSI. What you are proving is that the individual does not have the capacity to independently support themselves. Sometimes that's an IEP. For my son, I've never had paid employment when we applied. Even though we had tried, he hadn't even had a paid internship. So that was helpful because he didn't even have, he had no track record of earning any income. Some cases are very clear, like Gabby, I think it would be pretty clear with your son that he's gonna qualify for SSI. But if it's at all a gray area, you can also get a private evaluation. And I'm part of a Bay Area group of parents of adults with NDDs and ASDs and all the Ds and DDs. And some of them go to 3 evaluators until they get the report they want. And that's the one they hand in with the diagnosis. And they're like, no, actually, I'm doing this for SSI. And there's certain evaluators that will write reports for SSI. I don't know the ethics of this. I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying we know our kids, and not every evaluator is going to sit down and evaluate our child appropriately. So if you get an evaluation that really isn't covering what you think of as your child's ability to be living independently, it's okay to seek another evaluation. This might be at your expense or under insurance, but you only have to submit the evaluations you want. They're not entitled to access all of your child's medical records. You get to decide which reports you want to give. But basically, you're making a case that that your child can't do this independently. And the same for conservatorship. Like, we got a letter from my son's neurologist basically saying he can't even name all of his conditions. He doesn't understand how to advocate for himself in medical settings, which most of our young adults can't do well into adulthood, if ever. So it's documenting the need more than the label, right? So a genetic condition, it doesn't matter. SSI is not going to know any genetic condition. They just want to know, is this individual capable of working and supporting themselves? So.
I would add as well, if the needs are significant enough and obvious enough, you may not actually have to go through an additional evaluation. Our experience was SSI or SSA office did not do any additional evaluation. Now, maybe I inundated them with medical records and IEP documentation. So our process was pretty smooth and fairly quick, given that.
Yeah, that kind of ties into the next bit of advice that I would give is that even if you don't think there's going to be a long-term treatment benefit for seeing particular specialists, if you see specialists for each condition that can be diagnosed, just to get that documented and get that medical record in place, it does come in handy later.
I think every doctor we would see would probably have something they could diagnose. So, it's always a new diagnosis coming in. I want to turn it maybe now over to you all and just give you guys an opportunity to share anything that you think we haven't covered or something that you think is really important here. You know, I think we've covered most of the questions that have come in, but I would love to hear if you all feel like there's anything that's really worth highlighting that might help somebody on their journey, and think about how to get started if they're scared to get started, you know, where you might start, those kinds of things, just so that those of us who are on here that are maybe a little bit behind might get motivated by by your experiences and expertise here.
I think for me, what I could offer, my biggest worry actually was all the healthcare transition, because Avery was followed by so many specialists from birth, right? So 19 years of care. Be open to the opportunities that present themselves, even during this really unknown, scary time. I think a few of the biggest lessons for me were that I think we know this intuitively, but it matters. Pediatric model of care and adult model of care are different. So it's not as simple as my child has primary care and these 7 specialists, so I need to find the adult equivalent of each of those for them. Many times as an adult, you don't see a specialist for the things that our children are seeing specialists for as pediatrics. Oftentimes those are handled by adult primary care providers because they're trained through residency to handle more chronic and complex medical needs. So that said, one of the strategies that we've used, and I encourage other families to use, is if you're in an area where you have an opportunity to find a med peds trained physician they've been trained to care for pediatrics and adults internal medicine and pediatrics, find those providers. We tried this initially when Avery's first pediatrician retired. We transitioned to a med peds provider, hoping then that we could avoid future transition needs, but he left. We got a new med peds provider. They left. We're now back in the pediatric world again momentarily, but she's been fantastic, and we've been working with her and through other parents to identify who is the next person who is going to do primary care. I will go back to med peds, and I will do that for two reasons. My own doctor just retired. My husband, who sees the same doctors, retired. A med peds provider could actually see all three of us. And I think there's some significant advantages to that. One, a provider that is seeing and treating you as a caregiver knows, but also treating your child, whether they're peds or adult, also knows the implications of that caregiver burden. I don't love that word, but I don't have a better word for it. And I think that plays into recognizing stressors and mental health, physical health, those sorts of things, and caring for you as the caregiver in that way as well. The other thing that we have found success in, we've got a few providers that have transitioned, that we are seeing adult providers now. Physical medicine and rehabilitation is one, and then also hematology. And I found success just talking with those offices and asking specifically, explaining who my child is, what her needs are, who in your office is comfortable caring for a child with medical complexity who's nonverbal. I believe in sort of owning the elephant in the room and asking for what we need. And I have found that to be very successful. And so far it's panned out well.
That's really helpful, Holly. I think for me, this is one of the scariest things. I've talked to a lot of families who've been through transition, and that cliff that you talked about in the beginning, Audrey, that's where a lot of families see that, I am able to message all of my kids' doctors through a portal and expect answers within like 2 days. That doesn't happen in adult care a lot of the times, right? You're not going to have the same access, the same, clinicians who are really more aware of, even if it's a rare condition, at least the rare space and how to manage all of these things. So that's a really scary thing, I think, for a lot of us is that medical piece of not really having subspecialists anymore, not really having people who are used to caring for kids like ours who are nonverbal, who are, fully dependent. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about that medical transition and what that's been like, and any other advice, which I think that was great advice, Holly.
Yeah, I would just echo what Holly was saying. Our primary care point, we've always chosen someone who sees the full age range, so that while we're making that transition with the specialist, we don't have to be making that transition with that pivotal point in that central point. And I also want to echo that we do see the same provider for ourselves as adults as well. And it is wonderful to have that person be fully aware of everything that we're dealing with. So I know it's not adding much new, but I really appreciate that Holly contributed that.
For me, and we're lucky because our pediatric epileptologist is continuing to treat Adam as he's gotten older. It all comes down to who knows what they're doing, who is treating the seizures. The more seizures you have, the more everything else goes haywire. And so you want to find that person who is going to, be able to through whatever methodology they're using, decrease your kids' seizures. And, while we've been trained, part of it is how we come across to the doctor. We want to make that experience a good experience for them too, and there's all kinds of ways to do it. I know there's been, there can be a lot of angst and conflict in those short visits. We try to minimize that. So the doctor says like, hey, Adam's coming today, great. And the way we do that is, by the time you get to this part of your journey, you're a bit of an expert in terms of the meds, in terms of the side effects, in terms of what you're seeing, and you can report back to them in a way that it doesn't take a lot of time on their hands. You're not pestering them every minute, every weekend with a call, but they know that when you do call, it's a concern and they need to get back to you right away. 9 times out of 10 over the years, my gut has made more sense than my head. So I'd encourage you to sort of listen to your gut. And for every conference or every webinar like this, because we have dumped a lot of knowledge, a lot of stuff on you. If I can just come away with one or two things that I can incorporate into our life, I think it's a success. And you got to be careful that you don't fall into the rabbit hole of social media. I remember when we were first diagnosed, I'm on Facebook every night. And let's be honest, probably half the people on Facebook are wacky. That's the last thing you want to do is take some of their recommendations and incorporate it into your diagnosis. And probably, the last thing, and we do a lousy job of it, and moms, you do even a worse job of it, but take care of yourself. If you can't take care of yourself, it's going to be tough to take care of your kids. And this thing, unfortunately, it doesn't get any easier. But I've sort of come to this place in my life where I've accepted the fact that, hey, this is the way it's going to be. Okay. And as long as it's going to be like this, I'm going to have as much fun, and my kids are going to have as much fun as we can do in this short period of time that we've got left, because you never know when they're going to be gone. And my hope is that my kid dies before me, because I don't, in terms of this, the way this world is now, every day, cuts of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, people having access to meds, every day you can't get meds at Walgreens or CVS. It's crazy. And how you navigate that, it's just, I don't have an answer. But that being said, we're going to have some fun.
Yeah, I love that. And then you bring up something that I think a lot of us feel and maybe don't talk about a lot, which is this idea is that I hope my kid doesn't have to live without me, right? It's too hard to imagine. And I feel the same. I don't know, we don't even use like respite care, like outside of the home, because it's just like, they wouldn't know what to do. And I've heard horror stories. It could be great for some people, but for a kid as complex as ours, it just wouldn't work. Um, Audrey, Christina, anything else you want to share as we're wrapping up here?
I think you guys touched on some really important points, and that is, how do you perceive the future for your child? And I was at a conference recently, and I noticed that I started to see this divide in the different groups of parents. There were the ones that had the very severe children with life-limiting conditions where they knew their child was going to die. And then there were those that
Yep.
kind of had this expectation that their child would be along. And the latter, they seemed to have this sense of guilt, like they felt bad that their child was expected to live because they didn't have it as bad as the others. And at one point, someone just finally said, look, shut up. You need to stop saying that, because it's no easier to imagine your child's life without you than it is to imagine your life without your child. It really is kind of an equal challenge, regardless of that length of life that you can expect. It's just as serious, it's just as important, and it deserves your attention and your love. And I love what Dale says, that you just got to have fun, because all of us, we really don't know how much time we have left. And if you can say at any given point in time that person had the fullest life you could give them, then you can be at peace with what comes next. So I echo it. Have fun.
Audrey, I'm going to give the last word to you as our resident expert in this space.
We're doing it. So it feels really isolating and terrifying to be on this journey. It has every step of the way, right? Transition's no different than all the other terrifying things we've had to deal with. You're not alone. It feels isolating, but look at all the people that are here. Find your tribe, find your community, go to conferences, reach out to families. I know it's exhausting, but it's the way I've worked the whole way through. So I think we're here. I mean, our organization's here, all the Rare Epilepsy Network organizations. Find your tribe and build that community of support.
Yeah, those are beautiful words to end on. I think that, and I think our tribe is here, right? This is your community. All of the groups hosting this webinar today, the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance, Rare Epilepsy Network, Deep Connections, Angelman Syndrome Foundation, we've got CAS, and LGS Foundation, all of these groups are here to support. I know the director of the LGS Foundation, Tracy, says anybody who has really crappy seizures, terrible seizures, come and be a part of our group. It's just, there are people here who want to help. So reach out to all of us. I'm dropping in the chat here if you would be kind enough to take 1 minute. It's just, I think, 3 questions to let us know what you thought of today's webinar, what worked well, what didn't, how we can do better, if there's any other things that you would like to hear more about. And before we go, I want to give a huge thank you to Audrey, who's really the one who lassoed this all together and all of us. And a huge thank you to all of our guests for being here and sharing your experiences. And to Amanda, who's running behind the scenes and helped develop a lot of these resources, and Shannon, our deep staff member. We're really grateful to have you with us today. You will get an email that gives you a link to this, and you can follow Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance and Deep Connections to keep an eye out to see these resources being posted. Thank you, everyone. Take care and hope to see you in the next one.